Life would be tragic if it weren't funny. Stephen Hawking, English theoretical physicist, cosmologist, and author. All right. Welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast. If you're tuning in live, then I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. Man, I apologize for not being present yesterday. I don't really have a good way to communicate to folks and say, hey, looks like I'm going to be out. But yesterday I had a dental appointment. So that's where I was. I do apologize for no show yesterday. And if I can figure out a way to communicate that a little bit more easily, then I most certainly will. But for the time being, this is how we're going to have to do it. So we just have to kind of wing it as we go along here. So I'm doing a little bit more setup here, so I apologize. Give me just a second as I move. You can't see what I'm doing because I'm doing it behind the scenes. And just setting up one last thing here as we get going and we talk about multiple topics today, which I think are very interesting. I just kind of, what I do for random dad musings, I just look around and I see what people are talking about. And then I grab that. And that's what I do. So this is actually quite simple. So setting up one more thing, because I guess the text was a little bit larger than I realized. So I apologize for that, folks, doing a little stuff here while I'm live, and that's not really good. So we will be a little bit more prepared in the future, but there we go. We are good to go. So what first thing do we have to discuss? Well, let's talk about Charlie Kirk. Actually, let's not really talk about Charlie Kirk himself. Let's talk about something that he said. So let's play this clip because I thought it was interesting and it got a lot of people going. I don't have the stats on it, but there were quite a few comments on this. And, when you see it, you'll know why.
We basically told a great generation of young women, don't get married, don't have kids, go get a corporate job. And it's created mass political hysteria And then in their early 30s, they get really upset because they say, the boys don't want to date me anymore because they're not at their prime. And people get mad when I say that. Well, it's just true. If you're in your early 30s, I'm sorry. It's like you're not as attractive in the dating pool as you were in the early 20s. But again, you have your corporate job and cats. So I thought,
Okay. So he has two things there. Number one, we did tell young women to go out and get a corporate job and forego a family and maybe having children earlier on. We did that as a society, and there are implications for that. One of my favorite quotes from Thomas Sowell is that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And we told them this was a solution to whatever. And we didn't tell them what the trade-off would be. Now, I disagree with him in the second half, but in the first half, he's correct. We did do that. We did communicate. And when I say we, I know that someone will go, well, I did, and I argued against it. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, as a society, we kind of tolerated this idea, and we didn't really push this idea of, hey, you can do this or you can do this. It's really up to your choice. It was kind of like the women's power. Go out and do this. You don't need a man. How many times have you heard a woman say, I don't need a man, right? I can do it all myself. And how many fatherless homes are there out there? That's not a coincidence. That is a byproduct of what we as a society allowed to happen. And when I say allowed, I don't mean legislation. I just mean, like, there are things that you can allow via legislation, and there are things that you can allow socially, right? We could say, you know what? It doesn't have to be a law, but socially, bad or good idea, whatever the case is. And we permitted it. So we have to take ownership of that. And it's very popular right now to kind of like say, well, you get what you chose. Like, yes, you get what you chose. You have to stand by the decisions that you've made. But we need to be honest and say, we participated in that. We participated in communicating to you, young women, that that maybe you would be better off if you went and worked really hard and got that corporate job and got that C-level position, whether or not that was really what your desire was or not. Now, if it was, then great, great for you. But again, we still needed to, apologies, we still needed to communicate what the impact of that would be. What are you trading off for that? Well, if you work really hard in your early 20s and go to college, and then you get out of college, and then in your mid and late 20s, you work very hard to get that really esteemed position, then all of that time is going to take away from dating and from potential marriage. And so if you think about it, from 20 to 30, let's assume 20 to 30, that's 10 years. That's a long time. People get in the dating scene, they hook up, they find, different boyfriends, girlfriends, whatever, and then they find somebody that they are happy with and want to be with the rest of their life, and then they get married and they have kids all in 10 years. Like, that's very, very common. That is a very long time. And you can do all of that. You can hit the dating scene, be a little wild, sow your oats, settle down, have some kids. That happens in 10 years. So that's a long time. And it's time that's been missed out. Now, we're not going to get into this idea. Like, I don't really believe this notion that you'll see on the internet where they talk about, um, like, I'm trying to remember who says it, but there's a lot of people that are like, oh, well, you're out of your prime, your biological clock is ticking and all that. Like, we had our kid in our early 40s, so clearly it can happen. And I think I saw something the other day where they've changed it. They've lowered the age from 40 to 35 for what's considered high risk pregnancy. I think I saw that the other day. I want to say it was Austin Peterson's wife who just started a new show. I think that's where I saw it. And I happened to check it out. But again, there are consequences to decisions, and we have to, if we want the best society, we need to communicate what those consequences are, and then that way people can make fully informed decisions. So I think he's correct in that first part. Now, the second part, I was like, really? Like, because let's think about this for a minute. let's say I'm a 35-year-old guy. Now I'm not, I'm 45, but let's say I'm a 35-year-old guy and I'm single and I'm looking for an attractive woman or just, mediocre woman, mid, as they like to say on the internet, right? But I'm looking for a young lady to meet and hopefully marry. I'm probably not going to be looking for somebody who's 25. That's 10 years younger than me. So I'm probably going to be looking for somebody who's around 30, maybe around 35. So somewhere between 30, 35. I might jump it up a little bit. So let's say maybe 30 to 38, somewhere around there, right? Maybe even 30 to 40. Maybe I'm comfortable with, 5 years younger and 5 years older. So I don't know that it makes sense to say that as a 35-year-old guy to say, well, if you're 30, you're unattractive to me because I'm only looking for 25-year-olds because I would be looking for somebody who is 10 years younger than me. And I just think that is unlikely in most cases. There are some guys that like younger women, 5, 6, even 10 years younger than them, and so I get it. And there are plenty of single guys who are older than 35, like in their 40s. And so if I were single right now as a 45-year-old guy, I can assure you I'm not giving an opportunity to anybody who's 25. I'm probably not going to give an opportunity to anybody that's younger than 35. Like probably not. I mean, I can't guarantee it. I mean, you never know who you meet, but I'm that's not where I'm starting. That's not my starting point isn't going to be, well, let me find somebody who's 25 because I want a woman that's in her prime. Like, no, I'm already 45. So I'm going to be looking within some range. So the problem I think that Charlie Kirk has made is that he's associated this notion of when are you in your prime, the biological clock ticking. And yes, biologically speaking, a woman is in a better position to have children in her 20s than her 30s, than her 40s, and so on, right? Like, I mean, we hear about some stories here and there of somebody who's like 50 or 60 and they have a child, but that's pretty infrequent. So yeah, I get it. 20s, more likely, better situation, right? Like biologically, you're better prepared to have children than you are in your 30s, but you can still have them in your 30s because women do, and you can still have them in your 40s because women do, right? But I think he's missed the mark on that. I think what he really should have said was a lot of times, if a lot of men might be married already by the time they're 30, so there might be fewer men that are looking, maybe. Now, I think the distribution of men and women in the United States is about roughly equal. It's about 50-50. So if a woman is not married, well, then seemingly there would be a man who's not married as well. And so she just has to find him. However, I think the dating pool does shrink because, again, I think a lot of people are getting married, like there are people are getting married a little bit later, but people also are still getting married early on. And in your 20s, there are fewer people who are married to choose from overall than in your 30s, than in your 40s, right? Like your dating pool is smaller and smaller. And then a lot of it depends on where are you? Are you in a small town? Well, if you're in a small town, it's going to be a little bit tougher. If you're in a large city, might be a little easier, but you might have other requirements or things that are going to rule it out. So I think people, they rightly got irritated with him, but I don't think that we clarified that, yeah, he was kind of bright in the first half, and in the second half, it doesn't really make any sense, and we'd be better off attributing any challenges to the fact that people would already be married, or there would just be fewer people to look at, right? There would be the dating pool is just smaller. And I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever to be like, well, I'm a 35-year-old guy and I'm only looking for a woman who's 25. I don't think most 35-year-old men are doing that. And I can assure you that most 40, 45, 50-year-old men who are single are also not looking for women in their 20s per se. There are some, but I just think that as we get older, we tend to rule out the younger crowd because what do I have in common with somebody that could be literally my child? I mean, if you think about it, like I'm 45, if I met a 25-year-old girl, like if I had a child when I was 20, by the time I'm 45, they would be 25. right? So like this is we're talking about somebody that could literally be your child. So so that's what that's my comment there on Charlie Kirk. All right. So what else do we have? All right, we got my producer's heading out. All right. See you later, little producer. All right, so the producer's heading out, and now we can have the real show. Just kidding. Let's get going here. Let's see, what do we got? Um, let's see, what's the next one here? Got a little distracted there. Apologies. Okay, so the item that I was working on at the very beginning of the show. So let's do this. I'm going to read this. So for anybody that's listening, I'm going to read this out loud. There's no video to watch here. So let's. There we go. Now this is this is from Reddit. Am I the asshole? IATA. Am I the asshole for pointing out to my boyfriend that I make more money than him? Question mark. So here's the story. My boyfriend, who's let's see, so it's a female who's 26, and her boyfriend is 28, and she says my boyfriend and my boyfriend are on my boyfriend and I think she missed some words here. My boyfriend and I are on the same page about getting married and having kids later next year. But recently, he always jokes around about me only wanting to marry him to take half his assets when we get a divorce, et cetera, et cetera. Two of his close friends went through all that, and I understand where his concerns are coming from. Where coming from. Okay, so we're gonna have to work on some English here, but that's okay. There we go. Today he did it again, and that was the last straw. I immediately snapped at him by saying, well, if that's the case, it should be me who should be worried since I make 3 times more than you. He just went quiet and he went outside. I sat down thinking, maybe I was a bit harsh on him. Was it an offensive thing to say to a man? Am I the asshole? And my answer is no, you are not. Here's the thing. If you're a man, you need to focus on your hustle. Focus on you, right? Let's say you got a girlfriend or you got a wife and they're doing well. Your job is to support them. Your job isn't to compete with them. Because at the end of the day, if that person ends up being your spouse or they are your spouse, you are a team. My wife and I, we don't worry about who makes more. And we had different times since we've been together. One of us has made more than the other at different times because we're doing different things and we're in different places. Right? There was a time where I wasn't making anything because if you've watched this show or listened to the show before, you know that at about 35, I decided that I was going to be a web developer and I took a whole year off. So I wasn't making any money for a whole year, $0, right? As I studied. An opportunity that I had and I seized it. But what we don't do is we don't compare. Now, we might jokingly compare here and there, but it's not a real serious issue at all. Like we almost never talk about it. And and the comparison is like in the past, like the comparison has been to support each other. Like, hey, you can do well. You could probably make more than me, right? Like it's been that kind of a comparison in most cases. Very rarely have we ever compared who makes all the money or who makes more of the money or whatever, right? I think there were a few rocky moments, literally moments, right? But we didn't get hung up on it. So if you're a man, and I'm speaking as a man to other men. If you're a man, your job is to mind your own hustle, support hers or his, if you're a gay man, right? But support your significant other's hustle, whatever that is. And then you work on yours. And if their hustle happens to be bringing in more than you, so be it. I mean, think about it. If they're with you and they make more than you, they probably don't care, right? Like they're probably not too worried about it. So now if you're a young lady and your man's doing this, he's like always comparing and talking about divorce and, stealing all your assets, you need to set him straight. Like, and I don't think it was too harsh. And I think you need to have a sit down and say, look, either we're doing this or you're going to just sit here and worry about all the things that can go wrong. But we need to either do it or not. Right? Like we didn't spend a bunch of time. I don't think we spent any time talking about whether or not who was going to get half of what we did, what we felt was appropriate. We made good decisions and we didn't worry about it. We're not looking to the future to get divorced. That doesn't mean that you can't have a good plan and say, look, what happens if, let's have a plan. But you make that in the context of proper planning, not worrying and potentially accusing the other person. I would never, I would never accuse, if I was single and I was dating a woman, I would never accuse her of wanting to get married to me to take half my stuff. Now, there might be a joke here and there that you can throw out that might be appropriate, right? Like there are those times where you can make kind of a rude joke and it's deemed acceptable, right? It's the right moment, the right situation, and and she understands it, right? But if you're constantly talking about it, if you make the joke more than like once or twice, twice is max. If you make that joke more than once or twice, it's no longer a joke. Now it's your concern, and you need to deal with that. And if you can't trust somebody that you're about to marry, then maybe you shouldn't marry them. And women, you should not tolerate it. And men shouldn't tolerate it either, right? Like if a woman is making more money and she were to say, well, you just want to marry me so you can take half my assets, men, you need to set her straight as well. And again, when I say set somebody straight, that just means have a sit down and be like, look, this is not acceptable. This is not how we're going to build a solid relationship where we can count on each other to be there, because there will be moments where either one of you aren't doing so well. In my wife's career and in mine, we have had moments where the other person needed to be there, needed to be that shoulder, so to speak, because the stress level was just crazy. So we don't have time to worry about, okay, do they really just want half my stuff? No, because there were times when she was in corporate America and she was struggling with, people that she had trouble that were difficult to get along with. There were times when she was outside of corporate America and she just wasn't doing so well. And, like just working as a real estate agent and things weren't coming. And she kept working hard and saying, like, why am I not getting any business? Right. Like this is early on. And she needed support. She didn't need somebody that was going to be worried if she was there to take all his money. Same thing for me. There were times when I worked at companies where I had management that I was having a very, difficult time getting along with, and I needed the support of her. And I can't get that support if I'm busy crying about what she might do or what happens if we get a divorce. So it's an obstacle that you don't need to have. So, are you the a-hole? Not at all. You were not. And hopefully in this story, based on as I'm reading it, hopefully the guy comes to his senses. Hopefully that when he walked away and started thinking about it, he was like, maybe I ought not do that anymore. Maybe I should shut up, because yes, you should. All right, what do we got next? Let's see what we got next here. All right. So, this one's fun. This one's going to be so fun. I saw this a while back and I bookmarked it and I wanted to comment on it. And I've been, so I'm going to play this clip. It's a guy ranting about landlords. Now, it is a huge deal right now that I see people. It's been that way for a while, but it seems like it's getting momentum, this anti-landlord sentiment. And as somebody who has been a landlord, I'm no longer an active landlord, but we do have properties, but I'm not an active one, so I don't necessarily myself go out to the house. I got some things to say to this guy. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna play it, and I will stop at periodic points, and we will have some conversation.
Mao was right. Landlords provide housing the same way scalpers provide tickets.
Okay, so let's stop right there. So let's make sure we're very clear on what a scalper is. Okay, a scalper, and I'm reading this from Investopedia, just so we get a really good definition, because there's like two kinds. There's the kind that you're all familiar with, the one that stands outside the stadium and they're selling, tickets for for baseball. And there's also the kind that are in like Wall Street, and that's an entirely. I think there's probably some similarities, some overlap in how they're defined, but I think what he's talking about is the one that everybody is familiar with. So a scalper in the context of market supply demand theory also refers to a person who buys large quantities of in-demand items, such as new electronics or event tickets at regular prices, hoping that the items sell out. The scalper then resells the items at the higher price. For example, a scalper may buy 10 tickets to the Super Bowl and attempt to sell them on eBay several days before the game at an inflated price. This type of scalping is illegal under certain conditions, and such transactions often occur on the black market. Okay, so that's what definite. So scalping, for what he's talking about, what I believe he's talking about, is when somebody goes and buys a whole bunch of things, and they're hoping that at a certain point they are one of the only or one of the few who has these things, which means now they have a demand that people want. Okay, so that's just a simple definition of scalping. So let's continue on.
They don't. Landlords are a superfluous class.
Okay, well, I don't know. This is gonna be. This is like a what? This this is like a 1 minute and 20-second video. It might take a minute to get through this one. Okay, superfluous class. For starters, landlords are not a class. Like, you might call it a demographic or a group of people, but we're not a class. That doesn't make sense. You're just basically saying, here's this group of people that have, a similar behavior or something in common. They're a class. And in the context of class structure, I would argue they are not a class of people. And the reason I would argue, from personal experience, because I used to be the secretary of a relatively large organization here in Jacksonville, a real estate association, and I've met plenty of landlords. Some of them are mom and pop landlords. They have one to maybe only one property. Some are mom and pop, and they have a handful of properties. And there are some people who are not mom and pop. They've got a very lucrative business. They're doing very well, and they have a lot of properties. And then you have your Black Rocks, right? So your landlords, I would argue you can't be a class, because the landlords go from our typical class, our typical socioeconomic classes, right? Lower class, middle class, upper class. They span all of those classes. So it doesn't make sense to call a landlord a class. It is simply a group of people who happen to own one or more properties that they maintain and rent out. That is it. That's simple definition there.
Want to know how I know this? Because landlords don't provide anything of value.
Okay, so let's see. You know what? Let's continue on.
Landlords don't provide housing. Engineers, architects, contractors, construction workers, plumbers, carpenters provide housing.
Okay, so actually, no, they don't. None of those. You might say the architecture does, sort of. You might say the engineer does, but the rest of them, like, by themselves, they do not. They contribute to a house. So let's say I want to build a house. I'm going to need an architect. Now, the architect will draw it up and identify all the different materials and whatnot. And now I have a blueprint. I don't have a house. He hasn't provided a house. So then I need to go to the builder and I say, okay, well, here's the blueprint of what I want. Here's the land and so on and so forth. And so now I've maybe paid for the architect, and now I've maybe put some money toward my builder. I still have no house. Okay. Now the builder has to go and they have to find all the different contractors, all the subcontractors. So they're going to go and get an electrician, and they're going to go and get, the roofer, and, the plumber, and all those different people. Right. So now they're going to get all of those people individually. None of those people are providing a house. The plumber provides plumbing to the house. The electrician provides electricity to the house, right? Like the electrical wiring, actually, not really the electricity itself. Right. So individually, no, they do not. Collectively, they contribute to the building of a house. So he's wrong, because he's like, well, all these people provide housing. They don't provide housing. In fact, I could call up a plumber right now, and he can come and he could do work, and I could pay him if I had some need. I could pay him, and he hasn't provided me a house. He provided me plumbing. Same thing with electricity and roofing and other things. They're providing services regarding housing, but they're not actually providing housing. So he's entirely incorrect right off the bat. We're only like 20 seconds in.
Landlords come after and put their signature on a slip of paper. That's not providing housing. That's
Okay.
hoarding housing and ransoming it back to the public for more than it's worth.
Okay. So I'm sorry. I know I'm clicking a lot here and I'm trying to find a good stopping point. I didn't really, maybe I should have thought about it ahead of time to get a good stopping point. So let's first of all, so we're not, landlords do not come and just sign a piece of paper, right? Because if it's just sign a piece of paper, then that's all a property owner who lives in the home does. They just sign a piece of paper, right? And so you could make the argument that they don't contribute to homes in any way because like a homeowner just signs a piece of paper. But the reality is what happens is, yes, they do sign a piece of paper, but then what happens? Well, if we look at a landlord's going to make whatever repairs are necessary first. Now, in some cases, the landlord makes them themselves, and that happens. In some cases, they just hire it all out to all the people that he mentioned. Or in other cases, they'll do a combination. So I've known landlords who will say, like, look, I can't do the roofing, but I need a new roof. So I will go and I will hire a roofer to come out and put the roof on. And then this door that needs to be repaired, I'll repair it myself. Right. Something like that. So there's variations of what landlords do, which is the same thing that a homeowner does. A homeowner buys a home and maybe they buy a home that's already been renovated, or maybe they buy a home that needs to be renovated. Right. And they say, we're going to renovate this home. And some homeowners will live in the home. Some homeowners will live in a different home while they're renovating the new home, right? Like there's again, variations all over the place, but there is a similarity here because both entities, both people, the landlords, the homeowners, they're effectively doing the same thing. They're signing a piece of paper, as he would say, and then they are going and making whatever necessary repairs to improve the value of the property now that they own. Because the way that a home works, you either maintain it or it loses value. End of story. That's it. You maintain it or it loses value. Now there are landlords out there that don't maintain it, and and those are dirt bags. And in some cases, they're incentivized by the government. When the government puts on all kind of regulations, they may make it more costly to make these repairs, and so now people who are renting suffer. It's a conversation for another day, but they actually do provide value. They're not hoarding. I mean, I want you to think about the word hoarding. It's funny that he uses all these words, and I feel like he uses them ever so flippantly. So when he says hoarding, think about the show Hoarders. You walk in and somebody's got books and magazines just stacked everywhere, just piles and piles of magazines that they won't throw away. That's hoarding. They're not useful to anybody. They're just stored. Or maybe you go into their garage and their garage is just full of junk. And they're just hoarding. Hoarding doesn't have, I don't want to say it doesn't have value. It doesn't have the value that we tend to think of where other people can enjoy it or somebody can enjoy it. It's just collected. Well, landlords don't do that. They don't just buy properties and hold them just chilling because that doesn't bring any money. So they're not even hoarding. Like so far, we're 29 seconds in, and I don't know that he said much of anything that's true because I don't think he knows what he's talking about at all. Like he's not even making an argument about like landlords shouldn't do this or that. He's just trying to make this bizarre argument that landlords don't provide value and it only works so long as we make things up and use words incorrectly. So as long as you do that, then sure, I guess you have an argument. Let's continue. Maybe he says something good here.
Just like a scalper, private property should be illegal. Notice that I said private property and not personal property. Private property is property used to extract wealth from the general public. It's parasitic, it's vampiric, and it should be abolished. Everyone should be able to own their own home. One person or a board of directors or a corporation should not have the ability to hoard housing from people who need.
Okay, so again, he's using this word hoard. Nobody's hoarding it. And he's, in reality, I think, and I'm going to kind of make an assumption here. I think what his real complaint is are major corporations like BlackRock and whatnot that have a lot of property. I mean, I'm sure he'll be, like he did say, one person. So he probably is, annoyed by the mom and pop person, that isn't making tons of money on an investment property. So he's probably including them too. But I think his bigger grievance is against the corporations. That would be my guess. And again, as I said early on, there's a wide variety of people that are landlords. And you have some people that are making tons of money on it. And then you have some people that maybe aren't making very much money, if any at all, on it. Maybe they're just not a very good landlord in terms of, building, like they're putting more money into the house than they're getting back. Right. So those kind of things do exist. But again, he keeps going back to this word hoarding as if everybody is just taking all this property and holding on to it. And then he says ransoming it. Well, it's not ransom, again, because that's not how the word is used. A ransom would be if I steal somebody's child and I won't give their child back until they give me money. That's a ransom. But if you buy a home from somebody who owned it in the first place, then you didn't steal it and you're not ransoming it to the same person. Because if I buy a home from Bob and then I decide to rent it to Sally, well, I'm not ransoming it to Sally because I didn't take it from Sally in the first place. That's what a ransom is. A ransom is demanding money for something that somebody already owns. And Sally doesn't own the house. Now, if I somehow took the house from Sally, who was the legitimate owner, and then I demanded that she pay money back in order for me to give back to her, then yeah, it would be a ransom. But if I bought it from Bob and I rent it to Sally, it's not a ransom. And in no other context do we use ransom in that way. I mean, think about ransomware, right? That software that gets on your computer and hijacks it and says, all right, I'm not going to let go of your computer until you pay money. That is a ransom. It's the same context as if somebody kidnaps your child and demands $1 million. That is a ransom. It is your child, right? It is not their child. He's using words in ways that are not used anywhere else, and it doesn't make any sense. And then he's trying to make this distinction between private property and personal property. I don't know that I'm going to get into that too much, but what he's basically saying is personal property is anything that you need to live. Private property would be anything above that. So if you have 2 homes, well, you don't need 2 homes because you can only live in one. So therefore, 1 home should be taken from you. That's considered private property in his mind. And I look at it and I say, no, all of it is private property. Whether, there's no, so I would argue there's no such thing as personal property. It's private property. And who is the owner? I am the owner. I own the house that I live in and maybe 1 or 2 others, right? I own my, my car. I own my tools. Those aren't personal property. That's all private property. It's privately owned by me. I'm the private owner, right? So I would argue that there's no such thing as personal property. It's literally just private property.
It. They are literally using a human right as a way to extract profit. This is capitalism. This is what.
Okay, so no, again, That's not the definition of capitalism. Capitalism is just a matter of who owns the means of production, if you will, right? So if it's privately owned, then that's a capitalist system. And then if it's when we talk about regulation, that's when we talk about the free market. So if we say free market capitalism, well, what that would mean is a free market means there's very little regulations in play, and capitalism is who owns who owns things, right? Who owns the business down the road? Who owns the industries, right? Are they privately owned? Well, if they're privately owned, then capitalism, right? But they like people like this man like to attribute everything they don't like to capitalism. And he's like, whoa, people don't have a home to live in. That's because of capitalism. People can't eat. That's because of It's never the fault of, maybe bad legislation or bad decisions on people that are the result. Nope, it's always capitalism. And they'll find ways to manipulate the definition and be like, oh, well, if you're forced, like they'll say things like, if you're forced to go to work, then that's capitalism because you shouldn't be forced to work to live, right? Like there's a whole bunch of arguments. But again, they rely on this notion that you can be flexible with definitions. And so the first thing that when you're talking to somebody like this, or when you're listening to somebody like, pay attention to how they're using words. In many, many cases, they're using them incorrectly in ways that are not used elsewhere and in similar context. And so therefore, you can kind of point out and say, well, as long as we're adhering to definitions that you're making up, then yeah, I guess you have an argument. But once we get back to the real world where there are actual definitions that mean something, then no, none of what you're saying is true. Let's continue.
It does. It privatizes human rights, then ransoms it back to the public. You don't have a choice. You are forced to participate.
Okay, so there again, he's like, you're forced to participate, right? So there's that notion of like you're forced to, I have to go to work in order to be able to pay this bill. That's not fair. And again, he's using the word ransom again, and then he points out, he goes, you're ransoming it back to the public, but that's actually not true. The public is everybody. And if I buy a house from Bob again, and I want to rent it to Sally, not everybody needs to rent the house. So I'm not actually even if we're accepting his definition of ransom, I wouldn't be ransoming it to the public because not everybody in the public needs or wants it. So it's not a ransom to the public. It's literally me just saying, who would like this property? Maybe maybe I'm trying to resell it, right? Maybe I'm trying to rent it. Who would like to rent this property? Who would like to maybe purchase this property? And there's going to be a pool of people for either one of those, right? And there may be some overlap, but there's a small pool of people. So it isn't the public. So again, these are nice sounding words, like as people like to say on the internet, those are words. Yes. Beyond that, it's just a word salad. He's just throwing words together that sound attractive and they don't really have any meaning. Let's continue.
Bread or get dead. Profits over people. Property rights over human rights. That is capitalism. Everyone should be able to own a home. Nobody should go without a roof over their head. Yes, it might mean a few people have to give up their mega yachts, but so what?
See, there it is. Earlier I said, I think his real gripe is against the ultra wealthy, right? The class of people that have just tons and tons of assets and money and whatnot. And there he goes. He goes, yeah, some people will have to give up their yachts, but so what? But again, as I pointed out, landlords range from, the mom and pops who maybe aren't making a whole lot of money. And maybe they even still have, like, there are landlords who have one property that they rent out and they have jobs, right? They go to work, they work their 40 hours a week, and they have to be a landlord because the landlording is something that they're hoping to build as wealth for the future. And it's not presently bringing in so much money that they can buy a yacht or even a canoe. So again, I think his argument, he's conflating everybody with his grievance for the ultra wealthy. I think he's just jealous. I think it's envy that's really driving him. He's just mad because he's not the one that gets that's got it. So let's see. We got a few more seconds.
Who cares? Does it really tear you up at night that Jeff Bezos won't be able to dismantle a bridge in Rotterdam that his $500 million mega yacht can fit through? Get fucking real. Now,
oops, sorry about that. So again, like he ends it there, and I should have had some better stopping points. He ends it by talking about Jeff Bezos, and like, so again, he's griping. His grievance appears to be with the ultra wealthy, and so then he uses all these words incorrectly to make this argument, and it sounds attractive, like, oh man, like all these people are these parasites and all these, like, yes, those are nice words, those are nice little buzzwords, but in the end they don't mean anything. So let me end with this, and did this part of the conversation here by mentioning this. When you think of a transaction between two people, when we think of like a free market capitalist transaction, I want you to think of it like this. If I were to take this phone here and I were to say, I want to sell it to you, the viewer or the listener, the audience member, and I want to sell it to you for, say, $100. The question we should ask is, why would you pay $100 for that phone? If your answer is because it's worth it, that's not the right answer. It sounds like it might be the right answer, but it's not. The actual right answer is you believe that having the phone is more advantageous to you than having your $100. And I believe that having your $100 is more advantageous to me than having the phone. That is when we come to an agreement and we make the transaction. Similarly, if I rent out a home to somebody, let's say I rent it out for $1,000 a month, that person has determined that they would rather have this particular home for $1,000 per month. And I would rather have that person occupy my home rather than somebody else or have it empty. I'd rather have that $1,000 a month than have it empty. Right. So we're basically looking to improve our end of the bargain. Now, people like this gentleman will like to argue and say, well, this person over here, they were forced to accept it and they didn't, they would have rather had a better deal. Sure. Everybody would like to have a better deal. I would like to sell you my phone for $500. However, I know that ain't happening. So I have to come down and we have to negotiate until there's an equilibrium, until we get to the point where you're happy and I'm happy with the transaction. And if neither one of us can be happy, then the transaction doesn't happen, right? That doesn't mean that you're at the happiest point, because again, just like you might have wanted to get the phone for $50, I might want to sell the phone for $500, but we might actually agree upon a $100 transaction. And again, it holds true. The reason you gave me the $100 is because you felt you would be better off with the phone than your $100. And people do this all the time. Think about when somebody sells something on eBay. They try to sell something. Maybe they're scalping tickets, right? They're saying, look, I'm going to sell you this ticket for $1,000. I don't know if that's the going rate. I'm going to sell you this ticket to the Super Bowl for $1,000. Now I'm standing there. I'm looking at the stadium. I would like to go in and watch the Super Bowl. Maybe these are nosebleed seats. So I have to make a decision. Do I prefer my $1,000 or do I prefer the nosebleed seats and the opportunity to go and see the Super Bowl with my binoculars? Right? Like that's the decision that I have to make. And if I make the decision, then I have willfully made a transaction. Right? So this is what people like that are missing. They just don't understand economics, and they don't understand transactions in their simplest form. So he's dead wrong on that. Now I want to touch up on one more thing. I lied. I said this would be the last thing. One more thing on this whole landlord tenant. He's like, they don't provide any value. That's actually also, as I pointed out, there's another reason that's untrue. Many people cannot buy a home. Right now, he would probably make some arguments, but many people right now in their current situation cannot buy a home. maybe they've filed bankruptcy and they've just done very poorly with money. Maybe they don't have a lot of money. So, whatever the reason, the bank is unwilling to give them a loan to buy a home, right? And so that person has to have a place to live. So their only option might be one of two things. They can rent a home that's, from a landlord and spend a bit more money, but maybe that's a decent home. Or maybe they accept a lower quality home for which the bank would allow them to purchase. So it is untrue that landlords don't provide a service. They do. And in most cases, landlords maintain the property because if they don't, the property will lose value. All right. So there's that. Let's see. We got to get moving. I talk too much, I guess. Let's see. We've got this housing thing. Let me play this clip and then we're going to kind of go through a couple more things.
Suzanne, where are we going to put these people? The uncomfortable truth, as far as I can see it, is that we are going to have tent cities of asylum seekers popping up around the UK.
Well, I think you summed it up beautifully, Patrick, just the huge pressure that we're seeing now in accommodation. And that does seem to be the only answer. But I'm actually a little bit more worried than that, because I think this is all getting very sinister now. We know that we've had people who have been told that their properties are going to be compulsory purchased for asylum seekers. That pretty much tears up private property rights in this country. I was listening to the radio on the way here and they were talking about a massive problem facing Britain, which was older people living in houses that were, quote, too big for them. Who's got a right to tell you your house is too big for you? You should be allowed to live where you darn well like. And the implication was very clear. These elderly people are taking houses that they shouldn't have. And I fear that's a worry, that there'll be some kind of move to get them out of those houses. We've also had the horrible scenario last week when Matthew Paris, writing in the Times, talked about how euthanasia wouldn't be a bad thing if it encouraged elderly people to hasten their own deaths. So what? We've got to pop our clogs, have we, forcibly, when we're 60, 70, 80, 90, perhaps earlier, if we're not productive people in society, as Matthew Paris said it. So I think the whole thing now is getting really, really sinister and scary.
Okay. I agree. Now, I don't know when this video played. I just saw it on the internet. I assume that's relatively recent. What's interesting is the video that we just watched with the guy and the landlords are parasites and all that stuff. His ideology is how we get to the concerns that she expressed, because he's looking at it from everybody needs to have all of this, here are the minimums that I think everybody should have. Everybody should have a house. They should have a car. They should have, a stereo in their home, whatever the case may be. And if somebody has too much, then we need to take it from them. And she's basically describing the same situation where the government comes along and says, hey, wait a minute. That house is a bit big for you. I mean, I know your wife just passed and you're just a single old man, but do you really need 3,000 square feet? No, you don't need it. This family of 5 totally needs it. So we're going to take it from you. Right. And so his line of thinking leads us down that path, because it gets concerned with who doesn't have something and then forcibly ensuring that somebody does. And yeah, it might start with the wealthy, but it ends up coming down the line at some point, because at some point, the wealthy are either too connected and they find favors, or you just run out. One of the two. And if he thinks that he sounds like he might be a communist, and I'm not like, oh my God, the commies. I mean, he sounds very much like that. Sounds exactly like what a communist would argue. And where was I going with that? I'm busy making fun of the man, and now I don't remember my thought. So, but that's the path that we get, because he's so concerned about what people have or don't have that we forcibly take it from others. So then we look over at Great Britain here, and we're like, oh man, look what's going on over there. Like they're talking about taking homes. Now, if you think that she was making an exaggeration, well, take a look at this story here. And we're going to pull this up on the screen because it's kind of scary. Let's see here.
Suzanne, where are we going to put these people? The uncomfortable...
Stop. Wrong one. I clicked the wrong one. Apologies, folks. There we go. All right. So it's up on the screen. I'll read it for anybody that's listening. That way, you know what article this is. But this comes from the Daily Mail over in the UK, titled, "Our council tried to force us to sell our £200,000 home to make room for asylum seekers. Elderly couple's horror after strongly worded letter lands on their doorstep." An elderly couple who just moved into their £200,000 house were horrified to receive a letter from their council suggesting the property could be subject to compulsory purchase and used to house asylum seekers. Uh, I'm going to go with Joes and Ted Saunders said they were insulted and shocked when the strongly worded letter from Northamptonshire Council, which has never balanced its own books. That's a nice little dig. Dropped on their mat last month. It said their neat mid-terraced house in Rushton near Wellingborough was deemed to be an empty property or was derelict, and the city and the council could even force them to sell it. I couldn't believe it, said retired carer Joe's. I'm not sure how you say his name because there's no like. Anyway, we moved to Rushton to help provide childcare for my granddaughter and found this nice little place to live. The idea of forcing us to sell to make room for refugee and asylum seekers seems totally wrong. Now, you might be thinking, DL, you about to get into talking about, refugees and immigration? No, actually, I'm not. Although that is part of the conversation that we could have. So let's kind of address it very quickly, but we're not really going to get into it too much. When we have lots of regulation on property and what can be done with it, we get into shortages. And so if you have a bunch of people that are coming over, well, they're going to need homes. And if we have a shortage, then we put the government into a position of needing to do something. Now, this is a government caused problem. And when I say government caused, I mean citizen permitted, because the citizens permit it. So the citizens permit the government to do things, at least here in the US. I don't know, I'm not entirely familiar with the structure of government over in England and to what, opportunities there are for citizens to kind of push back and whatnot. So I don't know if they have like a Supreme Court that people can fight their way up to and, overturn major cases. And, I don't exactly know the details there, but I know over here we do have that, right? And so when we allow it, we put the government in a position to do more. So we always are like, a lot of us are like, well, the government needs to stop helping. We need to stop allowing them to do things that give them an opportunity to say, we better help some more. So again, going back on that guy that we watched a moment ago, who wants, everything to be distinguished between personal property and private property. That's the path that we get down, where we put the government in a position to make these kind of decisions, to say, looks like you don't really need this house. Doesn't matter what you bought it for, right? Like the price or the purpose. Doesn't matter why you bought it. You don't need it. And we sure could use it for some asylum seekers and refugees and other immigrants. But in reality, that's a problem of not permitting people to develop more properties. That's a problem if we start restricting people from owning properties and renting them out. These are all these problems lead to shortages. And when you have a shortage, the government loves to come in and try to do something. And I would argue they don't do it very well. Now you might think, DL, that's a problem over in England. What do we care here? Well, not so much. So let's take a look at another article here. And this one came in, this was published just recently here. So let me bring that up over here. All right. So no railroad. All right. So this is from the Institute for Justice. It says hearing officer rules railroads taking of private land is legitimate public purpose. Property owners will fight decision. This comes from April 2nd this year. On Monday, a hearing officer for the Georgia Public Service Commission, this is in Georgia, or the state of Georgia, not the country, ruled that Sandersville Railroad's attempt to take private land from several property owners in Sparta, Georgia, for the benefit of a private business, quote, serves a legitimate public purpose. The property owners, represented by the Institute for Justice, will challenge this decision. When the U.S. Supreme Court issued the unpopular and wildly condemned Kelo decision, the Georgia General Assembly passed strict reforms to ensure that nothing like that would happen in this state. Today's initial decision essentially undoes that work, said Institute for Justice Senior Attorney Bill Maher. This is a private company taking private property from people for its own profit and for the profits of a handful of private companies, none which serve the public. We will fight to ensure that the people of the state of Georgia are protected from this kind of abuse at every stage we can. Saundersville has filed its petition to obtain the authority to condemn and take the land owned by Don and Sally Garrett in March 2023. In May, the Garretts, Blaine and Diane Smith, and Marvin and Pat Smith teamed up with IJ to challenge this condemnation. In July, even more property owners joined after Saundersville moved to condemn even more land for its proposed rail spur, which would connect a private slate quarry to existing rail tracks. Okay, so we're not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to point out this is happening here in the U.S. People are having their private property taken. And the argument here is that it doesn't even fit the historical purpose, which was, if we're building a railroad track that extends from, say, Florida to Washington, D.C., well, there might be some properties along the way that are in the way. And so therefore, the railroad would be permitted to take some of those properties. Now, I would argue as a libertarian, they have no such right. But as far as our country is concerned and how it was designed, that was a provision that was in there, that you could take things that served a public purpose. So in this particular scenario that I'm describing, that I'm making up from Florida to DC, a railroad would serve the public interest, because you would have a railroad going from here to DC, and then you might have rail stations along the way for which goods could be transported back and forth. And so then people who lived in cities within some proximity of the rail stations along the way would have access to all these things. And so the railroad would, in this particular scenario, it would provide a value to people here in Jacksonville, maybe Savannah, Georgia, and so on and so forth, right? So that would be how you might define a public good. But according to the argument here, and I don't know the truth of it, but according to the argument, that's not what's happening. What's happening is the Saundersville Railroad Company, allegedly, again, they are utilizing this provision for their gain. That's presumably that's what's being argued. And if that's the case, it definitely needs shot down. Now, I would argue as a libertarian that they have no such right to private property, and that there's not even for the public good. Right? That's where I stand. I would immediately say no. If they're not willing to sell their property or their home or whatever's in the way, too bad. You don't get a railroad. Sorry. Too bad. That's where I would stand. Now, I want to point out something. A while back, I did an episode on the ruling from, remember the case with the immigrant who, during the BLM riots, fired his firearm, got caught by police, got arrested, and then they tried to charge him with a crime for being an illegal immigrant and having a firearm, which was against the law. And then he took it to court, and the district judge in Illinois ruled that based on the Bruins text and history test, which was basically to say, what does the plain reading of the document say? What's the history behind it? How do we apply this text historically so that we can apply it similarly today, right? I would argue that there is possible precedent here, that if it's true that Saundersville Railroad is not trying to grab property that it can demonstrate is for the public purpose, that the text and history test might apply here. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I could be totally wrong on this, but I'm looking at this and I'm saying, all right, if an illegal immigrant, if it was demonstrated that we had something similar where you had a non-citizen that was permitted to own a firearm under certain conditions. And so therefore we can look and say the text of the Second Amendment says that everybody can have a firearm, basically just basically says people should be armed or can be armed. And then the historical analog is that, hey, we had precedent where people understood that to mean that even somebody who was not a citizen could also own and carry a firearm. Then in the same way, we can look at this case and we can say, well, historically, this is how it was understood when property was to be taken. And does this particular case fit? So we apply the text and history test to more than just the Second Amendment, but to other cases. Because the Second Amendment comes from the same source documents that many of these other things, these rights that we have come from. And I'm not saying rights that we have as given by the Constitution, but just as defined. So I think that the text and history test might apply here. And this is another reason why people should have been very much on board with that ruling, despite the fact that the judge in that particular case was appointed by Obama. A lot of people got worked up and they're like, oh, well, it was an Obama appointee. Like, okay, well, so what? Did they interpret the law correctly or did they not? That's really all that matters. And then we look at it and we say, okay, now that this ruling has been made, are there other areas for which that ruling might be applicable? And I think it might be applicable here. Now, again, I don't know the law. I'm not a lawyer. So I could be like, somebody could say, well, according to this legal concept, no, it can't because of yada, yada. And so that's fine. I'm just talking like I'm thinking out loud and saying, hey, it seems like there's an opportunity to go back in history and say, well, what was the purpose of this? I don't think it was a statute, but what was the purpose of this provision that allowed people's property to be taken? Was it just what did we ever show? Can we look back and show that it was never utilized just to make somebody's business run smoother? Right, which appears to be the case here. And if that's the case, then it sounds like a text and history test to me. So that's what we've got today, folks. Hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you so much for watching. And again, I apologize for not being here yesterday. I will do my best to make sure that every single day, 7 a.m., we are having a show, because if you're going to get up early and watch the show, then I need to get up early and have a show. And I need to be on time. So we're going to do that. A lot of things going on here, but we're going to make things happen. And I've got some good ideas in mind for the future. So once I get this routine down pat, we're going to start implementing new things. So look forward to a lot of advancements this coming year. At any rate, be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. Make sure that you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer, my Rumble channel. You can go to youtube.libertydad.com, or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you're there subscribing, let me know how I'm doing by leaving me a comment. Last but not least, I want you to remember, if you are a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now,